With the horrors of the previous night behind us, it was now Thursday and we had to have the car out of Andy's yard by noon. We had taken up enough of his time and broken enough of his tools that it was about time we parted ways. But unless we just wanted to push the car down the road, there was still some work to be done and we had about 3 hours to make it happen. We also wanted to make the most of our time in front of the cooler since it was forecasted to be the hottest day so far. But unluckily for us, the car continued to be full of surprises and problems. We had a pair of new windshield wiper blades for the car, but when Sean went to install them, he noticed a problem with the driver's side wiper arm. The problem being that it fell off when he lifted it up.
So this wiper arm, the spring has broken the tap off, and without the spring it doesn't apply pressure to the windshield. It's not going to do a hell of a lot.
The passenger side arm seemed to be intact, so the plan was just to put that on the driver's side so that at least the driver would have some visibility. We didn't anticipate encountering any rain on the drive, and it would have to be good enough since I couldn't find any replacement arms anywhere. Though it did take us some time to find a proper tool to get the passenger side arm off. Back to the non-optional stuff, we had to get the engine running better. And the first step towards that is replacing the old needle and seat assemblies and setting the float heights correctly. The needles and seats sure looked fine, but it's possible that a thin layer of sediment or something like that was keeping the primary one from seating all the way. These are very easy to get to on a Holly, so in short order we had a new set in place. Starting off with the seat screwed pretty far in will give us a low float setting, which is an easier place to start from. But in order to get the level set properly, we're going to need the engine to be running, which means we're going to have to do some negotiating.
Who wants to start it? Okay, Florence. Interesting.
Sean kept his foot on the accelerator to keep the engine going, but it seemed like it still didn't want to idle.
Will it idle? Oh.
But as long as Sean can keep it going, it should be enough to get the float level set, so we'll pull out the sight plugs. I could see the level was a bit low, so we'll raise the seat up, and when we eventually get the engine running again, the float levels need a little more fine adjustment before they're just right and can be locked down. But something's still not working correctly. We had it idling last night, but it was also dumping in fuel from the mains. And even with the idle mixture screws 4 turns out, it wouldn't stay running. Andy grabbed his timing light and we capped the vacuum barb on the carburetor so that we could set the initial timing without any vacuum advance. And when checking the current values, there were some strange results. The timing mark was appearing on the wrong side of the pointer, which means it was firing after top dead center.
We got I'm guessing about 10 degrees after.
The car didn't seem to be running that bad, but something definitely wasn't right, so we'll loosen up the distributor, and Andy locked down the distributor at 10 degrees before top dead center. This did seem to increase engine RPM, and although the starter motor itself still sounds pretty bad, the engine would start more easily. Perhaps most importantly, the engine was finally idling on its own.
All the way? Yeah.
It was running at about 1300 RPM, but the fuel mixture still wasn't right. Spraying in carb cleaner had a huge effect on idle RPM, and it kept acting like it wanted more and more fuel to idle. That strongly suggests a vacuum leak, so we went hunting. The primary throttle shaft is letting in some air, but the bigger concern seems to be at the rear of the carburetor.
It's definitely doing something, yeah.
There does appear to be a bit of leakage towards the rear of the carburetor flange. We lowered the idle a bit more to 1200 RPM, and with it now running on its own, we decided to do a more full test of the transmission. That seemed to be working just fine, though we didn't make it through all the gears before the engine died again.
Oh, there it goes.
We decided to unbolt the carburetor and use an old trick to try to help it seal better against the intake manifold. The trick involves removing the gasket and coating both sides of it with heavy grease. This can help fill surface irregularities, and if the carb base isn't flat, you'll see areas where it doesn't squeeze out quite as much. With that tightened back down, we'll turn the engine over again and see how it sounds. But unfortunately, it seems to be acting about the same as before.
Didn't get any change from this.
Yeah. Do it again. It doesn't want more.
The next thing we decided to do, and honestly is something we should have done earlier, is check the torque on the intake manifold bolts.
Nope, that was definitely not as tight as it should be. Oh, yep, that's bad. Hopefully, that's all it was. Oh yeah, yeah, those are real loose, that's not right. Oh, that was like finger tight. Yep, not a single one was as tight as it should be.
After going around and tightening all of those down, we gave the engine another shot, and immediately it was acting very differently.
No, okay, definitely doesn't want more.
And after adjusting the idle mixture screws down to a reasonable setting, we were getting a half-decent idle. We went around again with the brake clean and even sprayed some inside the crankcase, but this time it seemed like it wasn't having any effect. This setup definitely needs more fine-tuning, but the engine idles now and is running mostly okay. Mostly. For a final test of the car, we will start the engine, let it idle for a minute, shut it off,
I'll let it sit for like 10 or 20 seconds and then give it 2 pumps of gas.
It's not the most graceful start, and the idle is still a little bit high, but it's not bad. We had just about an hour to get the car out of Andy's yard, so we very quickly threw it all back together, haphazardly collected and scattered all of our parts and tools between it and the F-150, and said a final thank you and goodbye to Andy as Sean and Rob climbed in the F-150 and I sat down in the driver's seat of the Pinto. And after only stalling once, the car rolled away under its own power from where it had been resting for so long. Once it got going, it seemed to be doing pretty well, and we made it all the way to our first stop at a gas station. We had, after all, only put about 2.5 gallons in the tank and then run the car all morning, so we had no idea how much was left in there. The tank in this car is either a 13 or 14 gallon depending on who you ask. But it took under 9.5 gallons to fill it up all the way, so it probably still has some very old gas sitting in it. Optimistically, by farther diluting the old gas, we might even get the engine running better and better. For now though, after days of seeing the car just sitting in Andy's yard, it's really amazing just to see it in a different setting. And after checking underneath to make sure no fluids were dumping out, we took another short drive to get some necessities at the store. What I wanted the most was something to help with the biggest drivability problem that I had with the car, and that was that the steering wheel and shifter were so damn hot that even with light gloves, I couldn't hold on to them for more than a few seconds. Also, and I really can't stress this enough, I hate that steering wheel. Not only does it get hot enough in the sun to blister skin, but it's also cracked, giving it nice sharp edges, it's way too thin to comfortably hold onto, has such a large diameter that it hits my knees while driving and makes it difficult to enter and exit the car, and is so close to being vertically symmetrical that if I didn't mentally keep track of the position of the steering rack, I would end up unsure whether it was facing up or down. Changing the wheel wasn't really in the cards for this road trip, but I could at least make this one a little bit less unpleasant. I'm not a fan of steering wheel covers, for a lot of reasons, but we also couldn't find one that would fit this anyway. So in order to pad the wheel out and make it a bit thicker, I got this double-sided Gorilla mounting tape, which actually laid down nicely and stuck to the wheel very well, and after one complete wrap of that, I laid down all of the light electrical tape that I was able to find. It looks like a mess, but it did fix the heat problem and make it much more comfortable to hold. Let's not forget about the solid aluminum shifter though. If I don't want B&M branded into the palm of my hand, that's gonna need a wrap with tape too. But even after 3 wraps of tape, this one didn't work quite as well. And if your hand slipped and hit metal anywhere else on the shifter, you could smell the bacon cooking. So at least while we're in this Arizona heat wave, it's not the most pleasant to drive. But we can install the 90-day Arizona permit and make it legal to drive. I securely taped it to a piece of cardboard to make it a bit more rigid since that rear license plate mount doesn't offer a lot of support. After making those parking lot modifications, we headed on over to another lot, the one out in front of Harbor Freight. We took a few minutes to hide in the air-conditioned store and bought a few tools that should help us work on and get data from the car.
Current feels like is 122 degrees. And its first actual 7-minute drive hit 230 when driving, about 235 when shut off. It's been probably 20 minutes and it's down to 205. Pressure's out of it. Hopefully just an air bubble, but I don't know.
235 in this weather isn't really surprising, but we would like to see it lower, and it got there pretty quick. The bigger concern than that number on its own is that it may not have been done climbing. The engine should be able to survive up towards 250, but we don't want to get anywhere near there if we can help it. So we may as well see if we can find any problems and do anything to improve that at all. One of the tools we just picked up was a set of hex key sockets that we could use to loosen up the plugs in the rear intake manifold coolant crossover, which could be holding onto some air. We'll start the engine back up. I said we'll start the engine. And once it's idling on its own, we can check the coolant temperature gauge. It's reading at about 170 degrees since the car has cooled down for a little while. We had also taken some of that time to add a basic coolant overflow. We zip-tied on the thickest plastic bottle we had, and this should help keep all of the air out of the cooling system. For whatever reason though, the car seems to be running a bit badly now. The intake manifold bolts are still tight, but it's acting like the setup is wrong again and I had to retune it just to get it to idle. Once it was idling a little fast, but much happier than before, we went around checking temperatures. The gauge on the dash still reads 170, and this infrared thermometer is reading the door panel at around 135 degrees, so the ambient's a bit high. The upper radiator hose is reading about 162 and the lower about 158. We let it warm up a bit more, and at this point the dash gauge was reading about 200 degrees, with the upper hose at 180 and the lower at 192? The lower is a different kind of hose, so maybe we just need to let everything heat up a bit more. We can also check the transcooler, which is looking good at 160. Something we noticed that was concerning us was that the last time the engine was started, the upper radiator hose collapsed for a moment. After a few minutes to cool, we started the car again, but it didn't happen this time, so we weren't quite sure what to make of that. But we had been wondering if the engine had the wrong water pump on it, and this symptom made that seem like a likely possibility. We let the car sit for another half hour to depressurize while we hid in the air-conditioned store before coming back out and pulling the upper radiator hose. A drain pan under the car caught all of the coolant that spilled out.
Caught it all. That was amazing.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
We wanted to verify coolant flow out of the upper hose, so we put it in the water jug and started the engine up.
Off. It's coming out the top.
That was violent.
Our highly calibrated scientific experiment tells us that there is coolant being moved around in the engine, but without a continual flow test, it's a bit hard to say for sure that it's being moved efficiently. Also, don't worry, despite the high flow, we still did catch all the coolant that came out in the drain pan. We clamped the upper hose back down and started the engine again. And the coolant temp was back towards 170. With it once again idling near 1500 RPM, we refilled the cooling system, and it's a little hard to see the flow in the radiator because the car is shaking so much due to the solid engine mounts. It's tough to see whether it's flowing across or just bouncing. This time we'll look at readings from the radiator itself, and after a minute or two of running, the top came in at 185 and the bottom at 184. There are a lot of variables and chances for inaccuracies in those numbers, but there seems to be a consistently inadequate temperature drop over the radiator. At this point, it's not impossible that it's just so hot outside that the cooling system is working correctly but unable to bring temperatures down to where we want them to be. The only way to test this will just be to wait. The sun is going down and it's only 110 degrees now, so we're doing good.
No, I'm gonna go ahead and say it only dropped a degree.
Oh, sorry, yeah, you're right, Rob. It's still 117 degrees. We were hanging around in the parking lot brainstorming ideas when a restaurant employee came up and offered us food and water, thinking we might be homeless. It's extremely kind of him to be going around doing that, although I did have to politely explain that no, my car just sucks. The three of us continued discussing other things that could explain the lackluster temperature drop over the radiator, and one that we could test out relatively easily was the absence of a thermostat. One line of thinking is that without a restrictor in the system, the water pump might be moving coolant through the radiator so fast that it doesn't have enough time to cool down. I've never been entirely convinced by that, but we do have a thermostat sitting around, so it seemed like a theory worth exploring. This is a 180 degree thermostat. Wish it had a hole drilled in it or a jiggle valve or something for bleeding, but it doesn't, so we'll deal with it. Maybe that'll fix it, who knows? What we didn't have was a bypass hose that goes between the water pump and the thermostat housing to circulate coolant within the engine before the thermostat opens. So, just minutes before closing time, we sent Sean off to the store to get that and a thermostat housing gasket. Rob and I stayed with the Pinto, and we once again popped loose the upper hose to drain the coolant and started removing the thermostat housing. We had that off just in time for Sean to return with more coolant, heater hose, and a thermostat housing gasket to go with the rest of our parts. Unfortunately, because of the orientation, limited access to the bolts, and the engine still being quite hot, this was not fun.
So this is about 20 minutes later. We're still doing the same exact thing.
Eventually, it was all back together and we refilled it with coolant, only to realize...
Oh, hello? Where's that coming from?
Hello?
No, where's that coming from?
It's coming out of the gasket. Oh good. It's pouring out. It is.
Yeah, I managed to get the thermostat pinched between the housing and the intake. So, lucky me, I get to take it apart again, cut out a new gasket to replace the store-bought one, and reassemble it. Hopefully correctly this time. Now we have fresh coolant and a brand new barely pinched thermostat installed, so hopefully we can start the engine up and have it stay cool. It started up like normal and went down to that 1500 RPM idle, but when I was checking things out in the engine bay, I brushed my hand against the wiring loom and the engine started to run really bad. I poked it again and it shut totally off.
Most power to the coil. Traced it back to this connector with all of the wires cut by one. Something in that connector is being funny, so we're just gonna not use it and go right to the source wire.
We actually had to trace that wire back up into the loom about 18 inches in order to get a good voltage source. And while I was trying to remove it, the wire also broke at the other end where it connects to the ignition coil. I ended up crimping a butt connector to the remains of the terminal, and secured both to the coil with a cocoon of electrical tape and zip ties.
Just rewired the ignition coil, and maybe that fixed everything. Who knows? It was pretty bad. That starts real quick. It did not start that quickly before. I didn't touch the gas.
The spark plugs are really dark. You think it's just incomplete combustion?
It could have been.
Who knows how long that wire had been a problem, but it seemed to be fixed now, and the engine was running much better and at a higher RPM.
I bet I can turn the idle down.
We lowered it down to 1300 RPM, which is still probably too high, but should be more resistant to stalling than if we dropped it farther. And after running the engine for a few minutes, we once again broke out the infrared thermometer to take some readings. The engine block shows 196 and the cylinder head about 205, which is exactly where it should be for a 180 thermostat. Perhaps most interestingly, the upper radiator reads 192 and the lower 182. Consecutive checks verified this number, and the coolant temperature gauge is showing 195, which is exactly where it should be with the 180 thermostat and is very much in line with the other temperature readings. It seems like our changes made some kind of a difference, although of course it's worth noting that the sun is long gone from the sky and it's only 100 degrees out. The only thing left to do is take it for another drive, so we packed up all our stuff and left the Harbor Freight parking lot. It seemed like a good idea to top off the tank since we had done so much idling, but the car only took 1.7 gallons. We decided that the Pinto would take the lead and we would continue heading back towards Phoenix. Even in gear, the idle speed is still pretty high, but the torque converter does make it easy to hold it at stoplights at least. Our convoy headed west, planning to take Route 202, the 35 miles back to Travis's apartment. Things were looking good, right up until the temperature gauge started climbing rapidly as we approached the freeway on-ramp, so we skipped it and went one street down to a neighborhood where we parked the car. The smell of coolant was in the air and there was just a bit of steam wisping out from underneath the hood. We waited until the vapor seemed to dissipate and then cautiously took a peek. It appeared that as soon as we pressurized the system by driving down the road, the radiator cap failed. Since I wasn't sure what would fit it, I hadn't purchased one for that aftermarket radiator, and now it was too late because all of the stores were closed. There was only a small amount of coolant loss, so we just cleaned the cap and reinstalled it. We had only managed to make it 3 miles down the road before hitting 240 degrees and having to pull over. So we all agreed there was no way we were making it back to Phoenix tonight and we would just have to park it somewhere nearby. And unfortunately, the best place we could think of was back in the direction we came from. The Pinto got there at about 230 degrees, but there wasn't any dramatic flare this time. None of us wanted to leave a car that we couldn't lock in the back corner of the Walmart parking lot at 1 in the morning, but we didn't have a lot of other options. Defeated, we all got back in the F-150, drove across the street to Jack in the Box, and then headed back to Travis's apartment. After that long, hot, disappointing day, it was a rough 45-minute drive. But Sean got us there safely, and we ate our soggy fast food before dozing off for the night. Even though we had abandoned our road trip car in a parking lot, at least we did get to drive it around a little bit, so the push to get it working well enough to actually start our trip was pretty strong. With that motivation, and hoping with all of our might that it was for the last time, we headed to Apache Junction in Travis's truck. It was so incredibly nice of Travis to let us use his truck and stay at his place for so long that he actually had to leave on a road trip of his own, which left us in an unfamiliar state, driving around in somebody else's truck and staying in their apartment while we were totally unsupervised. So, you know, that's a lot of trust to place in us.
To the clearance bakery section!
Yay! Woo! Why can't we ever get real food?
It took going to 2 separate auto parts stores, but we did manage to find a radiator cap and the other small parts we were looking for. And when we got back to the Pinto, we were all a little bit surprised, and some of us may be a little bit disappointed that it was still there. I mean, come on, who wouldn't want to steal this thing?
Yeah, very shaded over here.
We're desperate. Sorry,
You
Travis.
just scrape the little flower.
Yeah, it's fine.
Oh, they're gentle.
Since it's looking like we're stuck with the car, we should probably try to keep it from overheating and or just falling apart. Other than a $50 sized puddle on the ground from what's probably just the transmission dipstick tube, it doesn't seem to be leaking anything. We also checked all of the lug nuts and they're all still tight, which is great because that front right wheel is a bit sketchy and has the wrong kind holding it on. We took a brief respite from the heat to head into the air-conditioned store, and headed back out to the car with groceries and more parts over the bumpiest parking lot that I have ever rolled a cart through.
Oh my god.
See? You see what I'm saying?
It's shaking up my teeth. It's like frothy now.
By this point, I'm sure everyone is very tired of hearing us complain about the heat. Nonetheless, here comes another round. We're used to reasonably high temperatures and high humidity all summer, which is maybe more uncomfortable, but the dry heat and intense sunlight of Arizona brings with it its own set of challenges.
Ow.
At every opportunity, we're leaving the cars open to help them air out. We'll have to be careful with the passenger side window crank on the Pinto though, because it does take a lot of force to roll up and down. And as if we somehow hadn't learned already, we'll have to be careful with which foods we keep around.
What did you do to that Snickers?
I left it in the sun.
Resuscitated.
It needs to go.
Absolutely nobody is surprised about chocolate melting in the sun, but I had previously purchased these banana nut muffins, and for the time that we were in the store, they sat out in the truck bed. This turned out to be a mistake, as the sun was hot enough to start melting the plastic container they were in, which formed itself around the remaining baked goods. Those are both fun illustrators of the heat, but as somebody from the humid East Coast, this one really surprised me. I didn't care for the look of the bright shiny silver radiator hanging below the bumper, so I sprayed it off with brake clean, and then gave it a light coat of this high heat flat black paint. Check out how fast the spray paint, which wasn't even in the sun, was drying. Even laying it on really heavy, it only took about 10 seconds to be dry to the touch. And yes, the painted part of the radiator won't cool quite as well as bare aluminum would, but I was pretty hopeful that the radiator cap would at least mostly sort out the overheating problems. There was one other minor issue though, and that was that the coolant overflow bottle actually melted. So we needed one that was a little bit more sturdy, and Sean had just the thing. Only problem was all the liquid inside of it. But in mildly disturbing fashion, Sean was able to take care of that. This is a larger and much sturdier bottle, which should stand up better to the hot coolant. And with that securely zip tied in place, we'll get it filled up with a 50-50 mix.
Pour real good. The camera's on.
I've never spilled an ounce of coolant.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's always a gallon at a time.
Yeah, I thought so.
We'll also remove the old radiator cap, which is rated at 16 psi, top off the system, and get out the new, also 16 psi rated radiator cap.
I had to go to 2 stores to get this. First store only had ones with the levers, and the hood wouldn't clear that lever.
So it's a good thing we were able to find this one, and it does in fact fit. And once that's in place, we're ready to start the engine for the first time today. Unlike all the other times, it started instantly and settled into a 1200 RPM idle fairly quickly. We'll have to let that run for a few minutes to warm up enough to pressurize the system and make sure it stays sealed. It'd be nice to get the idle down to 900 or 1000, but until we've fixed some of these other issues, it seems okay where it is. The higher RPM with the big camshaft really smooths out the idle, which is definitely nice with the solid engine mounts. After a few minutes of idling, the cooling system was holding pressure nicely.
That's a good sign.
That's a very good sign.
My ankles are hot.
That's not a good sign.
The gauge was sitting at just above 190 and everything seemed to be working the way it should. The bright green front-mounted coolant overflow is definitely a look, but it seems to be doing its job as air bubbles are coming out through the hose. It was seeming like the only thing left to do was take the car for a
Test drive with a new radiator cap.
The starter seemed a little bit hesitant on the hot start, though it did get it going. But before the car was even out of its parking spot,
that.
I said I hate this steering wheel, didn't I?
Yeah.
It's lower profile now.
Yeah, there you go. Definitely has got torque.
the car was still running well and felt nice and peppy.
Not overheating yet. Your camera might be. Ouch. Oh god, there's a door? The door makes a lot of noises.
Yeah, I told you. Second gear still. That's probably like 45 maybe?
Maybe a little slower. You're at 200. Just stay right there, buddy. Just stay right there. I tried to catch it.
You did. 215.
We kept circling on local roads and I tried different engine RPMs and shifting times to see if any of that had an effect, but it was seeming like the increasing coolant temperature correlated directly to engine RPM.
That's still going up every time we're moving.
220, yeah.
It basically stops when we're sitting still.
If it stays at 220,
Yeah, if it stays at 220, that's again
Yes.
for how hot it is.
yeah, it's really hot. It's been at least like 6-7 minutes.
It's longer than last night, and it's way hotter.
Yeah.
But it didn't want to stay at 220, and just a minute later when we started moving again, it was climbing back to 240. It didn't seem like the temperature was going to stop increasing, so we pulled over and shut the engine off for a bit.
This will be our life.
At lower RPMs, it's fine, but at higher RPMs, it climbs really fast.
If it's running lean or the timing's too advanced, might be running a little hot.
After a couple of minutes, we started it back up and headed back to Rob and our favorite parking lot.
God damn it! I tightened it pretty good. Oh.
That was 5,000.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that's probably as high as we should get.
There's
230.
230 again.
In all likelihood, over the short term, below 245 degrees, we shouldn't be causing any engine damage. But over a long drive, which is exactly what's ahead of us, 230 is pretty warm and isn't where we want it to be running. We decided to pull a spark plug and examine it to try to get an idea for the general running conditions in the engine. The plugs only have 15 or 20 miles on them, and we have been doing a lot of idling, but they're looking a little bit on the lean side, or at least have been running a bit hot.
It's gray, yeah. It's very clean, too.
I made a few phone calls and found out that the Napa we were at just a few hours ago actually had some carburetor jets. So we convoyed over there and I started taking things apart.
It's got 64 jets in there. I'm pretty sure those are too small, and it's running a bit lean based on the spark plug especially. Hopefully giving it a lot more gas on the primaries will make it run cooler.
Once the front bowl is drained, we can pop it loose and remove the metering block. Out come the smaller jets that we will be upsizing, and
Just for kicks, we're gonna replace the old power valve. I don't think it was a problem, and this new one is the same. They're both 6.5s.
I couldn't find any local power valves anyway, so we would have to make the 6.5 work. Just finding the jets was a stroke of luck. They had an ancient looking Holley assortment and only had one of the 72 jets I wanted, so we picked up 70s and 68s for a little bit of range. And we'll get that reinstalled, making sure the gaskets are all still in good shape. While I messed around with that, Sean took a look at the door latch bushings and found out that the passenger side door rattled so much because it didn't have one. Unfortunately, we couldn't source a new one, but fortunately, we did have a lot of electrical tape. This was going to get torn up over time, but for now, the door closed nice and solid. We were hanging out at the store for a while and had a chance to talk with most of the staff. They were all very kind and supportive, if a bit surprised by how far we were trying to drive the car. After a while, one employee that saw we were still out in the sun even brought us bottles of water and told us all about the Pinto that she had back in the 70s. We were meeting all sorts of kind and interesting people, and they all seemed to have Pinto stories of their own, with the common thread that they hadn't seen one in a very long time. We got the carburetor back together and did some idling and revving.
No, it's running good. You can actually smell gas when you really rev it now.
Sounds better. The tip over from idle to like a low level throttle is also gone. 70 was probably a little too much, but let's see how hot it gets on the road. Hopefully that's all it wanted.
With the richened up main circuit, Rob and I got in the car and took it for another spin around the block. But it wasn't long before we were back to the Walmart parking lot with a nice toasty engine. It was seeming like every time we made a change it would do a little better, but it was not good enough. We had picked up a timing gun from Harbor Freight and decided to recheck the ignition system. After all, when it was set the first time, the coil wire was barely even attached.
Still getting hot. Hopefully this is it. Something's up with the timing. It was reading with the advance connected like 3 or 4 after top dead center.
Clearly something funny is going on and we're gonna need to do some testing. We got it set to 10 degrees initial at Andy's, and the distributor is still tight, but it's reading very differently. So we need to take a step back and confirm what we're looking at. Unfortunately, we were well into the evening at this point, and our light was quickly fading. Despite our intentions, we had spent another entire afternoon messing with the car, and it still wasn't where we wanted it to be. But we were still committed to making this happen, and we would have to do what we could to get the car running better. We picked up more supplies to help keep us cool and alive.
Hey, stop documenting the suffering.
And pulled out the #1 spark plug so that we could verify the top dead center mark on the balancer.
We're gonna get a 15/16 socket to turn the crank pulley and use a screwdriver to verify top dead center. And if that's correct, then the timing is super jacked up.
Unfortunately, the only ratchet we had to turn the engine over is a little on the short side, but it's okay, Sean is strong.
I'll be slow.
Okay.
Going now.
That's a good turn.
Thanks.
He worked on slowly turning the engine over while I felt the position of the #1 piston through the spark plug hole with a screwdriver. Once that reaches the top of its travel and stops moving, it's close enough to top dead center for what we're doing.
Still going up?
It was moving too slowly.
Oh, god damn it.
Didn't feel it move. That might be it.
And fortunately or otherwise, the balancer and timing tab were dead on. So it appeared that the timing really was far off and we would have to correct it. With the vacuum advance disconnected, it was reading off the scale after top dead center and needed a lot of adjustment.
Factory is 6 to 10. I figured it was going to use a little more. That's 12.
But perhaps due to the idle RPM, it seemed like the vacuum advance was coming in too soon, and at 12 initial it was reading over 30 with the advance connected at idle. This made the idle noticeably rougher, and up towards 2000 RPM we were seeing 50 degrees, which the car definitely did not like.
It sounded like it was popping, like backfiring a little bit. Why does it sound like it's running so rough now?
It sounds choppy. Yeah, it sounds pretty bad.
A lot. That is way too much.
You can hear the huge difference in idle quality and RPM when just disconnecting and reconnecting the vacuum advance. Normally you'd see an increase in idle RPM when connecting the canister, but in this case it was doing just the opposite. The extra timing provided by vacuum advance can help keep the engine cool, so I really didn't want to disconnect it, but it was behaving a bit strange and just pulling in way too much timing with no way of adjusting it, so for the time being we decided to leave it disconnected. We'll plug the vacuum line so that there isn't any leaking, and we'll run with 10 degrees of initial and 30 degrees total advance for now. Throughout the starting and stopping of the engine though, we noticed another problem. The starter was a bit unhappy.
12.2 volts. That's not great.
But a cranking test was a bit worse.
Oh! 6.
Whoa.
Yeah, we killed the battery.
All the starting and stopping and leaving the doors open all day had not done us any favors. But a battery that's just low is a problem we can fix. We did a bit more messing with the timing, and things seem to be working correctly now, so other than a flashlight with a large lithium battery falling onto the headers, the car was doing pretty well and running maybe the best it has. We had also picked up a vacuum gauge to help with tuning, but since there's only a ported vacuum source that's available, we can't get the most actionable information from it. It does tell us that less than 10 inches of mercury is pulling 15 to 20 degrees of vacuum advance, which is why it wants so little initial timing. The car had been running for at least half an hour at this point, and it seemed to be happily sitting at 195 degrees. Until I took it for another spin around the local roads, and it heated up just like it did before. As with pretty much every other time, it seemed to be better, and it lasted a bit longer, but even in the dark of the night, after a few minutes it still ended up at 235 degrees. And measuring a cylinder head with the infrared temp gun gave some verification to that reading. So what's next? Well, we decided a coolant flush was in order. It was now 11 p.m. and most places were closed, but we needed a whole lot of water. Sean and Rob took the truck to find a pharmacy or gas station that was still open and stocked a lot of 1-gallon cartons. Sooner than expected, they returned and had found an opportunity.
Remember that gas station we were at where the lady had a heat stroke?
Yeah.
My friend's got a car that's overheating and we're trying to flush everything. Can we use your hose and flush it? He was like, yeah man, that's totally not a problem. Fill it up with water, drive it over there, and then we can just sit there and hold it with the hose.
The first time we drained the system, it was looking a bit dirty and there was still junk coming out into the overflow.
Yeah, it's pretty gross in there. That's a lot.
So we were hoping that by running water through the system we could get more of that out. If the water jackets are coated with rust and dirt, they're not going to be transferring heat to the coolant very efficiently.
Okay, we're gonna try to flush it. Hopefully that does something.
All right, getting a shot of this drain pan doing its job and catching everything.
A little warm.
But so far, it's caught every drop. Look at that, every drop.
How many quarts is this oil?
How much coolant is in the block?
Oh, hot. That's hot.
We wanted to get as much antifreeze out of the system as possible, which meant draining it all and refilling with water before heading to the gas station. We can't get it all, but we'll try to minimize the amount of antifreeze that makes its way onto the ground and dilute any that does because it's attractive and poisonous to animals.
How are we gonna empty the reservoir? Oh God, Sean. Nice. You want some water?
Coolant on my back.
Yeah, I see.
Sorry, I'm happy about that.
I'm sorry.
Once the radiator's been drained, we'll refill it with plain water.
Excuse me, is that distilled water?
Yep.
We'll get that capped off and pack up all of our tools before hopping in our vehicles and heading over to the nice guy at the gas station. It was a short drive to get there and uneventful.
It's running really good. It's like 185, yeah, there's cold water in there.
But we'll still make sure everything is nice and cool and the system is depressurized before opening the radiator cap. Sean unhooked the lower radiator hose and the clear water going in was also clear coming out. We'll also unhook the upper hose, but we can't really backflush this system because somebody installed a thermostat. And that was annoying, so unless it seems like there's a lot of filth coming out of the system, we're not going to go through the process of removing it. To circulate water through the system, we'll reattach the lower radiator hose and put the garden hose in the radiator inlet. Then we'll start the engine back up. Water is circulating inside the engine block as it normally would until it heats up enough that the thermostat opens.
It's open. Oh.
Yeah, it's like 195. The water's still on, the hose still on?
Yeah, it's on full blast.
With no thermostat, you would expect to see a lot more flow than this, but because that's in there and the water going into the radiator, while being the hottest hose water I had ever felt, is still cooler than the engine and the stat probably isn't opening very far. So a fair amount of water is coming out the radiator inlet and hitting the accessory belt. That water is getting everywhere.
Look at this glistening man.
We'll reattach the upper hose and get the system filled back up, and the car seems to be idling happily. As usual, it was sitting nicely at about 190 degrees, so it was time for another test drive. And I shouldn't even have to tell you at this point how that went. This time, after hitting 235, I just let the engine idle on the side of the road, and it did do a pretty good job of cooling it down. So even idling at 1300 RPM, not only will it not overheat, but it actively will cool the engine down. I met back up with a disappointed but unsurprised Rob and Sean at the gas station, where we decided to jack up the front of the car and try once again to bleed the cooling system. We didn't have a nice floor jack anymore, but we did still have a little hydraulic bottle jack.
I was just leaving it here so that if it falls, Sean doesn't die.
Oh, sorry.
Only we couldn't actually get the front of the car that high in the air because
The back of the car is so damn high.
but with a little bit more assistance, we got the front of the car as high in the air as we could. The idea is that we want to make the radiator cap opening the highest point in the cooling system and where all the air bubbles will naturally migrate to. And we were seeing a lot of small bubbles, so there was air coming out. That's a good sign because it's removing air pockets from the engine, but while the stream did slow down, it never totally stopped. It could just mean that it needed more time, or it could be that it's bringing more in through a leak somewhere. And just as we were talking over the possibility of a blown head gasket and what we would do about it, a police officer rolled into the gas station and walked up to the three of us sitting on the rear bumper like pigeons on a high wire. To our immense relief, he just was checking on us, making sure everything was okay. We talked for a few minutes about our trials and tribulations with the Pinto as well as his own project cars before he went on his way. We were glad to have that positive encounter, but it also told us we should probably vacate the gas station before we wore out our welcome.
There's something about this that makes me really uncomfortable.
Hey, me too.
We sat the car back down and left the cooling system full of that questionable hose water. At this point, it was almost 2 in the morning and we did not want to abandon the car in that same parking lot again. So instead, with the Pinto in front and the F-150 following, we started heading back to Phoenix. We thought it would be for the best to avoid highways, so we stuck to local roads for the 35 miles back. The engine very quickly got up to about 225 degrees, but as long as I kept the RPMs down, it didn't seem like it wanted to go much higher. The night air felt great blowing in the windows, and I'm sure it was helping the car run cooler. Yeah, it was still 95 degrees, but it felt a whole lot better than it did all day. This was by far the longest drive in the car yet, and I was starting to get a feel for it. It took right around an hour and 15 minutes, and we arrived about 3:30 in the morning, but we made it back to Travis's. Sure, we were still a few thousand miles from home, and we'd actually gone farther west in heading back to Phoenix, but it still lifted our spirits immensely, and we slept well that night. Instead of rushing for another whole day, we decided to get a few things done on the car now and leave Phoenix tomorrow morning. The first thing to address was the missing Gatorade bottle.
The coolant overflow zip ties are still there, so the bottle just melted off.
It came off at some point during the drive home, though none of us actually noticed until the car was parked. We'll also have to better secure a few things like these transcooler hoses that are just flapping in the breeze. There's a lot in the car that needs organizing, but we'll be handling that tomorrow morning. What we will do right now is pull the car into a shaded parking spot and give it a full checkup. First, we'll pull out all of the spark plugs and look them over. I'm not sure why cylinder number 4 appears to have a slightly darker porcelain than the rest, but otherwise they're basically identical. They're a little on the hot and lean side, but there are no signs of damage or cylinders that have been burning coolant. We were also still a bit worried about how bad the starter sounds and wanted to see how it did with no plugs in the engine. It doesn't sound happy to be doing what it's doing, but it is still functioning, and it does not look like something we could easily change, so we're gonna just have to cross our fingers that it keeps going. And we're pretty much out of ideas, but since we also want the cooling system to keep going, we're going to add a new reservoir. This is a cheap universal one that I've had good luck with in the past and we were able to find locally. Rob found a good place to mount it on the fender where we could get one bolt through and just zip tie the other two mounting tabs. Once that's in place, we'll fill it about halfway up and then top off the radiator. The level inside of it was below the tops of the cores and looking pretty low, which did not help with our fears of a blown head gasket. We talked over getting a testing kit, but realized that none of us wanted to deal with it even if it was blown. So for better or worse, we decided to just stay ignorant about it and perform an automotive sin by using a head gasket in a can. If the engine does have a leak, it's very small and there's a chance that a product like this could help to plug it. It could also plug up the radiator and everything else, but that seemed less likely, so we figured it was worth a shot.
Ew, why does it look like chocolate milk?
Delicious.
There wasn't much else we could do for the car at the moment, and we got kicked out of our covered parking spot, so we pretty much just decided to call it a day. We let the engine idle for a good long period of time to get the engine warmed up and the sealer circulating within the system. The temp gauge got up to 195 and didn't get above 200 the entire time. That's right where it should be, so at least when sitting still, the cooling system appears to be adequate. We gave everything some time to cool down and went back out to the car with one more thing we wanted to try. We'll be adding a bottle of water wetter to the system, which can theoretically help improve the cooling system's abilities. None of us have ever actually used it before, but it does have a reputation for making at least a little bit of difference, and we need all the help we can get.
Ooh,
Very
glittery.
But the system was too full and we weren't quite sure how to get more in there.
It's gonna be close. Well,
momentum. Pretty good.
You got too much.
Yeah, it's good enough, I think.
It's in the system.
Even in the dark, it was still hot enough that none of the video equipment was working very well, but what about the car? Sean and I hopped in and took it for a spin around some local roads. The heat and pressure of the engine put under load was supposed to help with the head gasket sealer, so we wanted to give it an overnight head start. Unfortunately, the car behaved exactly as it had the previous night and was running pretty hot but never actually overheated. At this point, we can't keep stalling forever and we really do have to head back east, so it's just gonna have to be good enough. We parked the car for the night, and although it wasn't the first time we had told ourselves this, laid down for our last night in the city. There's no way you're No. Absolutely not. We were committed to leaving today, so we had to, in the most space-conscious way possible, pack everything up. That was pretty impressive. It was a lot of junk that we had to fit into that small car along with the three of us, so it's definitely going to require some arrangement Tetris.
It'll fit. The cooling system doesn't leak anymore, everything's fixed. I hit the road, no overheating, it's perfect.
We needed the power of positive thinking on our side, but we also needed a good battery. And once everything is shoved into the car, we'll never be able to get to it again, so we should probably test it now. The surface charge on the battery was 12.8 volts, but with the key on and radiator fan running, it was
12.28. It got down to like 9. Do it again. Oh, that time it was better. That time it only got down to 10.
Even with that large, new battery, the voltage still dropped pretty low during that first cranking test. I had brought along this jump pack and wanted to see if adding that to the battery would help things out.
See if it'll save our ass.
Beep beep.
God damn it.
Yeah.
Also the wrong color. Shit.
Got him.
Shit. At least this thing is smart. Smarter than me.
The voltage stayed a little bit higher, but it didn't make a big difference, which makes me think the battery's not at fault. We might be getting voltage drop to the starter through the long wires and the body ground, or the starter is just drawing a heck of a lot of current, possibly because it's failing. Which, again, is not a trivial problem to solve, so we're really just gonna have to hope for the best. We'll cover the battery up and start going through everything we're going to need to fit in the car. Some old parts were kept as spares or just to have, but many of them were thrown away. Everything needed to be consolidated, and certain things like aerosol cans needed to be kept out of direct sunlight. And of course, on all the car parts and tools, we needed our luggage to fit in there too. He may have thrown away a few too many things, but Sean did a great job of getting things to fit at all. But while opening and closing the hatch a bunch of times, it became clear that we would have to do something about the hinges. See, they were barely attached to the car at all. The hinge pins looked bad too, and it appeared that some kind of repair had been attempted on them in the past, but the passenger side pin was only through one side and the hinge was just barely holding itself together. I looked around online and couldn't find anything about these hinges, certainly not a replacement part, so I really did not want to break one. That means we have to tighten them down to the body, and, well, there's no access panel through the headliner. And it seemed like if we tried to take off any of the edging, it would all just fall apart, so I decided to just cut a slit, which felt pretty bad since the headliner was in decent shape. I'm so sorry, headliner. But this got us access to the studs that come through the roof of the car, which we covered with RTV and tightened a nut back down on. That'll keep the hinges from wobbling around and hold them in alignment, so hopefully no farther pin damage occurs. And with the hatch closed properly and securely, everything is shoved into the car. It's actually kind of amazing how much we got to fit in there, though it wasn't a pleasant seating experience, especially in the back. Admittedly, not a great choice for a 3-person road trip. Then again, none of this was about making good choices. We'll take one final check to make sure all of the fluids look good, and they do. Even the radiator is still full all the way up to the cap. The level in the overflow also looks about the same, so we didn't lose any significant amount of fluid during that test drive. With everyone feeling at least a little bit hopeful, we said goodbye to Travis's trusty F-150 that really saved us, hopped in the Pinto, and went to the nearest gas station. Unfortunately, it was immediately apparent by the awful rubbing noises that the car's rear suspension wasn't up to the task.
With all the luggage in the car, ride height's not horrific, but with 3 people in the car, it rubs quite bad.
The fenders are rolled a little bit, but the tires are so wide they can't tuck in anyway. So over every little bump going down the road, they run into the fenders and rub pretty ferociously. Those tired old, tiny leaf springs clearly aren't happy carrying all this weight. With just 2 of us and luggage in the car, they have a significant reverse arch. I measured and checked nearby, but the leaf springs are a bit of a weird length and nobody has anything that'll work. Load leveling shocks could have helped, but I couldn't find any of those either. We had limited time and tools, but I had an idea on how we could make this work, so we headed to a hardware store. Which is where this 4x4 fence post comes in. It was by far the cheapest piece of correct-sized lumber in the store, and luckily the very friendly employee had no issues cutting it up for us. We did not tell him what they were for. With the 2 6-inch chunks we needed, I went to the hand cutting station and did a bit of creative carving with the handsaw. This included a few different notches cut into the blocks. Back in the parking lot, these were finished with our trusty screwdriver and hammer. With all that chiseled out, these are shaped exactly how I wanted them to be for this. Yep, just like the pioneers on the Oregon Trail, we are using wood as our suspension. I hope it's pretty obvious that this is a stupid and bad idea, but just in case you were thinking about doing this, don't. Now, instead of the tire hitting the fender, the axle by way of the 4x4 will just hit the bump stop. The blocks are held tight to the axle with some DIY U-bolts, and everything is zip tied together on top of that to make super sure that we're not throwing any parts at the cars behind us. With everyone in the car, it's pretty much on the bump stops the entire time, though at least we do still have some downward suspension travel. There are many reasons this is dangerous. One of them is that the lack of travel could cause a lack of stability. But I'd rather take that chance than know for sure that the tires will be hard up against the fenders and cause all kinds of issues. So we're working with what we've got.
Somebody put your foot right here and bounce it a little bit. Oh, buddy. Oh, you picked the right person for the job. That really doesn't look that harsh. Squish, squish, squish.
With everything in motion, it doesn't actually look that bad. That leaf spring has definitely had about enough though. I suspect that shock being on the short side has helped pull the arch out of it over the years.
The brackets are rubbing a little bit, but whatever.
It's not gonna hurt nothing. And well, there's one last thing we're going to do before we start the drive for real. It was a little cooler today with the high of only 114 degrees Fahrenheit, but even just making it to the hardware store, the engine was running at 230. I was kind of hoping to avoid doing this, or at least save it for a last-ditch effort, but we were going to take the hood off and strap it to the roof of the car to hopefully help decrease engine bay and engine temperatures. This is a pretty old-school, time-tested method, and the engine is so shoved into that engine compartment there can't possibly be a whole lot of airflow around it. So hopefully this will be just the edge we need to keep the temperature in a slightly lower range. Pretty sure this is the most secure a hood on a roof has ever been. We sandwiched a mover's blanket between the hood and the roof of the car, and ran probably too many ratchet straps around the whole thing to hold it in place. We need to make sure it doesn't move when we're bouncing around on our wood suspension. The whole setup of the car is kind of unfortunate, but we really can't keep putting off leaving. So after looking everything over one more time, we all got back in the Pinto and got rolling.
Hey! No problem. Ow! Yeah, don't touch anything. Stop touching things.
As soon as we started driving, it was clear that the tires weren't rubbing anymore and the suspension felt much better. When hitting bumps or coming to a stop, there was definitely some bouncing, probably from the rubber bump stops.
But it's not scraping. I haven't heard it. It's not scraping. It's not scraping. This is how it
There was definitely some bucking in the rear of the car, but
It's not bad up here. Not bad. It feels okay over here.
yeah, Rob will tough it out. This first drive was actually just to drop off Travis's keys with a friend of his in the area. We briefly had the car on the highway and it seemed reasonably able to keep up with traffic, though it was still pretty warm. Altogether, the drive took about 25 minutes, and it's hard to say exactly how much difference the hood made, but the car was still running at about 235 degrees.
You want to hang out somewhere until the sun sets and see how it does then? It might just be the cooling system is not good enough for this heat. I don't know. We sure sound good just rolling around the parking lot though. It does that nice.
The little city car.
Yeah, 25.
Great. That's fine. That's how it wants to be, you know?
I don't think so. It's like running kind of bad.
Oh, I love this. I love heat. I'm from Arizona.
We decided to just take a break and wait a few hours for the sun to go down. We hung out for a while in the freezer section of a grocery store and tried to figure out a reasonable plan for how long we wanted to be driving.
That's a lot of ATF under there. I think it's the main seal and then the dipstick tube.
Pinto, why do you want to die so bad?
It's old.
We weren't sure how far we could get on the car's small gas tank, so at least for now we wanted to go gas station to gas station and keep the journey to under 100 miles.
Can't tell if the coolant overflow is working.
Yeah, me either.
Looks like it hasn't
Yeah, it
changed.
looks like it hasn't moved at all.
Yeah, it hasn't sucked anything
Well,
out.
it looks
That's
higher.
Does it? Oh, it smells
weird,
really weird.
It's weird, right?
Did you smell the water wetter?
No.
It doesn't smell like exhaust though.
We got food and waited until the sun had dropped out of sight to head back to the car.
It's not nearly as hot.
It's way better.
Mine still says 108, but it doesn't feel that hot.
With everything and everyone packed in, we stopped to top the gas tank off and then headed out of town. Since we weren't yet confident about highway speeds, and because we kinda just wanted to see more of the country, we were going to avoid highways for now. For a specific destination, we chose a gas station in Eloy, Arizona that was about 55 miles away, since that seemed like a reasonable distance for the first leg of this journey. Once we were out of the city and on a more or less open road, it was clear that the car did not like high speeds. Whether we got there through slow or rapid acceleration, and whether we were on second or third gear didn't really seem to matter too much. As soon as the car was moving more than 40 or 50 miles an hour, it got real hot real quick. The way we ended up driving was not based on the speed limit or the tach really, we were driving based on the temperature gauge. Whatever speed kept the engine between 225 and 230 is where we stayed. And the avoiding highways thing seemed like less of a good idea since there wasn't a passing lane, and we kinda just pulled off to the shoulder to let cars go past so that we could crawl along and try to stay out of other people's way. Despite that, since it seemed like we mostly were able to regulate the temperature, we just kept on going. If it hadn't already been made clear, it was crystal by this point that it wasn't going to be an easy drive. And as if to punctuate this, the road we were on suddenly turned to dirt. The car really got a workout here, and we thoroughly tested everything we had strapped down and the blocks in the rear suspension. It was also clear that, even though those headlights may be 20% brighter than factory, they're still not very bright when you're on a dirt road in a reservation out in the middle of Arizona.
This looks like a bump. Oh my god. Damn, you should have hit that at like 60.
Soon enough, the dirt section ended and at least we were back on a paved road. While sitting in the backseat bouncing down these dark trails on a very short travel rear suspension, Rob came up with a name for the car. Pogo, which was appropriate both because of the bouncing and because of the clown car-like nature of how much stuff we had shoved into it. Pretty soon, we were back to seeing other cars on the road and we pulled into our gas station destination. We had made it the 60 miles to Eloy and it only took us about 2 hours. We just drove 57 miles, and it only took 4.33 gallons, over 13 miles per gallon. And that was without a gas cap.
Because I guess I forgot it at the station. Whoops.
Yep, the gas cap either wasn't tightened enough and fell out, or I just straight up forgot to put it back on. And what better time to do that than going down a nice dirt road? The sides of the car are covered in dust, and I'm sure the inside of the tank is now too. So I hope that fuel filter is up to the task. But whatever, there's nothing we can do about it right now, so we better make sure the rest of the car is staying together. Springs are still looking good.
You mean the wood?
Springs are still looking good. And we'll get back on the road heading east. We were still trying to avoid highways, which meant we needed to take a much more northern route. We decided to aim for a gas station in Peridot, Arizona that was around 100 miles away. What we didn't realize, despite the route taking us directly through a place called Top of the World, was the elevation. We took Route 79 to Route 60, which went up and up and up and up and up. And with everything else we'd put it through so far, it wasn't surprising that the Pinto wasn't a fan of this. On some of the steeper sections of road, which honestly didn't seem that steep, we had to slow down significantly. On the longest uphill run, the engine got towards 240 and we decided to pull over onto the shoulder and let it cool down for a bit. We checked the elevation of some nearby areas and it seemed like our climb was far from done. We were going to tough it out though and get the car through it even if we had to keep stopping. To be honest though, this stop on the side of a random road was actually very interesting to me. It's darker on the video than it was to the eye, but boy, it sure was dark. And even reaching out with a bright flashlight, the brush and cacti seemed to go on forever. So for that, I'm kind of thankful to the car for encouraging us to pull over in the middle of nowhere because it was really cool. But as we've already well established, the car is not. We finished the rest of this portion of the hill climb at a blazing 30 miles an hour and consistent 235 degrees. Eventually, we reached Superior, Arizona, and decided to stop there for a bit. We had only gone about 60 miles and made it halfway up, currently sitting at 2,800 feet, with the next city, top of the world, being at 4,800. And it was only going to get steeper from here, so we had to do something. That something we had purchased earlier in the day as a Hail Mary. Yep, we're breaking out the weed sprayer. The idea being that we mount the nozzle in front of the radiator and run it from inside the car, so when the engine gets hot, we spray water onto the radiator, which through evaporative cooling should help us bring our temperatures down at least a little bit. The hose that came with the sprayer wasn't nearly long enough, so Sean dug out some of the fuel hose we had in the car and ran that between the pump and the sprayer instead.
Okay, that might actually do
Yeah.
something. That covers a good bit. We're getting freaking high tech here.
This is the opposite of my tech. But okay.
While we were stopped, I also pulled the spark plug just to get a sense of how everything was doing, and it seemed about the same as before. As we get higher, the air should be thinner, so theoretically it should run a bit more rich. Maybe that could help bring temps down, but we have our backup heat dissipation plan ready just in case. As one final check before getting back on the road, we retightened the carburetor and intake manifold bolts, and it's a good thing we did because they were fairly loose. Whether the gaskets had compressed farther or the heat cycles were causing everything to move around a little bit, it was good to cinch these down again, and we'll definitely have to keep checking them. So with those tight for now, and a full gas tank, we returned to our hill climb. Just like before, we would stick to a moderate speed and try to keep temps at or below 230. Every time we got to a steep section or the gauge started to climb, Sean, sitting in the passenger seat, would start pumping the weed sprayer. And while it wasn't exactly like turning the cooling system from off to on, it definitely was making a difference. If we maintained the same speed or went a few miles an hour faster, it seemed to drop temperatures by 10 to 15 degrees. Which, with us climbing up another 1,500 feet, was really appreciated. Still though, it was a rough drive. At a few of the steepest areas, we were in first gear doing 15 miles an hour up the hill. If we weren't doing this at 2 in the morning when almost nobody else was on the road, it could have been really dangerous. Also, the sun in the sky and the added heat of the day may have made this section impossible. We were all really tired, but glad we decided to wait until night for this stretch of the drive. And once we made it past the peak of the mountain, we were pretty much downhill the rest of the way, and the car was much happier with that. Thanks to the weed sprayer, perseverance, and a whole lot of luck, we were rolling down the road at 50 to 60 miles an hour, and it felt like we were finally getting somewhere. This section of the drive is admittedly a bit of a blur because it took everything I had just to stay awake. But we made it. Right around 4 in the morning, we rolled into the gas station we were aiming for. We were all exhausted, but decided it was time to switch drivers because I didn't think I could safely do any more.
We're in Stafford? Stafford.
Sean was going to take over, and I would be in the passenger seat manning the weed sprayer. Other than revving the engine at Andy's house, this was Sean's first time behind the wheel of the car. The shifter takes a little time to get used to, but he picked it right up and we were cruising. He was able to maintain about 50 miles an hour, and every time we came up to a hill, I made sure the radiator was getting sprayed. The system seemed to be working, and the gauge stuck right around 220 as the sky started to lighten. The sight of this brought complicated emotions.
Can't wait till the sun comes up and we bake. Yeah, it's gonna be great.
On one hand, the beautiful sunrise silhouetting mountains was a sight to behold, and it meant that the car and us had survived the night. On the other hand, it meant that temperatures were going to start increasing, and we had been up for like 22 hours. Though all of this time spent with the car was helping us find ways to live with some of its quirks, like how a Haynes manual perfectly blocks the searing hot air coming through holes in the transmission tunnel from burning your calves. Sometimes you just have to celebrate the little victories. On a particularly empty and beautiful stretch of road, we stopped to take a breather. This trip, this car, this place had all felt like a surreal joke up until this moment. But suddenly, sitting in this problematic, wacky car with my best friends in this amazing landscape felt different. We had all bought one-way plane tickets, there really never was an out, but this was the moment when it felt like we might actually be able to make it. Because of the age of the car, the mixed up parts, everything we half-assed, it always felt like the car was right on the edge of falling apart. And yet, here we sat 200 miles from where we bought the car in a huge expanse of land with jagged cliffs as far as the eye can see and the sun creeping up from behind them. We and those supporting us had spent so much time and energy planning this trip, getting to the car, making it somebody's definition of roadworthy, and forcing it to drag our sorry asses all the way out into the middle of this gorgeous valley. And suddenly, it seemed worth it. The last few months, the trip had been a reality. It had been something we said we were going to do. But despite taking steps to commit ourselves to it, it was still kind of a joke. It was a silly idea and such a ridiculous car to choose for it, but stopping at this location after a whole night of driving is what made it feel real.
And now I know you were all so slowly losing yourself, but you held all the pieces tied together so well.
Woo! We sure did spend a lot of time screwing around with the car, but we got it working well enough that it should be good to go the rest of the way home. Right?
My friends all tell me you'll propel me right back in the ditch. I'm altruistic, masochistic. You just scratch my itch.